Well, thanks so much, Paul, for that kind introduction, and nice to see everyone in Zoom world. I'm zooming in from Seattle, the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish and Duwamish people. And my name is Steve Smith. I use he, him pronouns. I am the founder and lead consultant at Experiential Consulting, LLC. We are a risk management consulting company that uniquely works with outdoor and experiential education programs, wilderness therapy, outdoor adventure, colleges, universities, and conservation corps, and so forth. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. I have a long background working at places like Outward Bound and the Student Conservation Association. And I had a real enjoyable 3 years serving as the chair of the Wilderness Risk Management Conference. So if what we talk about in this session is interesting to you today, I would suggest that you join us at a Wilderness Risk Management Conference at some point in the future and have more conversations like this. Today, we're going to be talking about a pretty interesting and in some ways a simple concept. Risk management can have a lot of heaviness to it and a lot of serious stuff that we grapple with. And it doesn't always have to be heavy. It can be pretty fascinating, pretty interesting, and even fun. And to me, this is kind of a fun and interesting topic to talk about. And I'm going to present some stuff. And then we're going to jump right in, and you're going to work in small groups and share some of how do you apply the concepts from what we talk about here today. So there is the intro, and feel free to use the chat to dialogue amongst yourselves about what we're talking about, share your ideas and questions. Paul's going to monitor that, and if there's something really relevant there, Paul, feel free to jump in and interrupt and bring that to my attention. So emergent risks is what we're here to talk about today. And these are risks that arise from management of other risks. So we're going to give you some examples of that. Emergent risks that emerge from our management of other risks. And in order to do that, I'm going to put this in kind of a philosophical, theoretical foundation for us so that we can really see where this concept really fits. And the reason why we're going to talk about accident causation is that how we think about accidents affects how well we can learn from them and manage them in the future. So I bet many of you may have your own hardwired, baked in theory of accident causation that you may not even consciously think of that way or call it that. But I bet, look, we're going to go through some different models here, and I'll be curious to see if you would connect yourself and your way of thinking about accidents to one of these different models. So this is a very common way for people to think about how accidents occur. The domino effect. This is an actual image from a book that came out in the 1930s by a guy named William Heinrich, who kind of introduced the world to this idea of the domino effect. And Heinrich's model, I would suggest, is still extremely prevalent in how people think about how accidents occur. In Heinrich's model, one thing leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. Things that happen in the social environment, an act by an individual, a mechanical or physical hazard leads to an accident that causes an injury. So it's this very linear model, and it's useful in that it gives us a story. It gives us something we can easily understand. It gives us a way to point at a domino and say, this is the domino that we really need to work on. This gives the risk manager a job to do, right? So it's a very convenient model, and it's easy to understand, but it's extremely problematic in that it's completely unrelated to the way that the real world works and the way that things happen in the complexities of something that's not basically a conveyor belt like situation. So let's move on from the very basic linear William Heinrich's domino model. And we're going to look at another one that I bet some of you have seen, which is this wonderful and fascinating Swiss cheese model. Raise your hand if you've seen the Swiss cheese model before. Okay, a couple hands going up. For those of you not familiar with it, this comes to us by a brilliant man, James Reason, who wrote a very dry book called Organizational Accidents. And he introduced the world to this Swiss cheese model. And the idea behind it is that hazards begin at one end. And in order to penetrate all the way through those layers of defenses, the holes in the Swiss cheese need to line up. The Swiss cheese, of course, represents these different layers of protection that we can create. Things like, management, controls, we can have policies and procedures and equipment and stuff like that. And only when all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up can a hazard go all the way through and cause an actual injury to someone. So the idea behind James Reason's theory was that we need to add more layers of Swiss cheese, right? And we need to make the holes as small as we can so that hazards don't penetrate all the way through. So this is useful in that we're getting away from the simplicity, a little bit of the dominoes, and we're starting to look more upstream of the actual accident itself. We're looking at things, inherent to your program, like your policies, your procedures, your training. Who are your people that you hire? What is the equipment that you provide? It's starting to get away from the immediate cause of the incident, and it's looking more upstream at things that, are organizational aspects that we can influence. But you'll notice if you look at this model, it is still a fairly linear model. It's a fairly linear way of thinking about what is in fact a pretty complex experience. Just for fun, there's a closer look at the Swiss cheese model, but just for fun, I'm going to show you this other one that someone recently came up with for COVID. You can see the layers of Swiss cheese. There's at this end, we've got personal responsibilities, and over here, we've got more shared responsibilities. It's things like the layers are things like masks, not touching your face, contact tracing, vaccines, financial support from the government, stuff like that. Pretty good, use of James Reason's idea for COVID. And notice this little detail. If you see this mouse here, chewing on the edges of the Swiss cheese and enlarging the holes and weakening the layers of defense. This is the misinformation mouse, making people doubt things like science, doubt the effectiveness of masks, doubt if they should get a COVID vaccine, stuff like that. So the misinformation mouse, enlarging the holes in the layers of Swiss cheese and making us more susceptible to the hazard of COVID. So it's kind of a fun, new take on James Reason's old model. So we've looked at a linear model, we've looked at a complex linear model, and now we're going to look at a systems way of thinking. And in the real world, where so many different factors are happening at once, it is not a simplistic linear model. What it really looks like more, if you had to use a Swiss cheese analogy, it's more like this. The complexities of the interrelationships between those different hazards and between our different attempts to manage those hazards. This is much more representative of how things really work in the three-dimensional world that we operate. So this is more of a systems thinking way of looking at accident causation. So there's a closer look at that. You can see this interrelationship between the different layers themselves. So that's a nice visual to lead us into the topic that we're going to talk about today, emergent risks, ones that arise from our management of other risks. So I'm going to give you some specific examples, and all of these they're set in 2021. All the examples I'm about to give are COVID related, just to keep it contemporary and keep it relevant. But this is certainly not, this presentation is not about COVID-19. It's about the concept of emergent risks. So I'm going to give you some COVID related examples. I'm going to talk about driving, talk about tool use, talk about foggy glasses. I'm going to talk about anxiety. I bet some of you see where I'm going with this. So we can manage the risk of COVID-19 by having all of our participants in our programs drive themselves separately. At the same time, what have we always said forever? That driving is one of the most statistically hazardous things that we do, right? So we can manage the risk of COVID-19 by having everyone drive separately to the trailhead or to the activity. But now we've got 20, 30 tired drivers on the road as a result. We've managed one risk, we've created another. Let's talk about tool use. Like imagine the context of like a volunteer service project where they're removing invasive plants as part of a service project for the day on some, at some park. And they've got a policy that to manage the risk of COVID-19, people aren't supposed to share tools. Supposed to pick up a tool and use that same tool all day long. Sounds good, right? We've managed the risk of COVID-19, but now you've got a participant using a pair of loppers as a hammer, right? Because they're not allowed to use the actual hammer. Or overuse injuries from people doing exactly the same repetitive task all day long because they're only allowed to touch and use that one tool. So an emergent risk that wasn't part of our original risk assessment, but is now one that we've created through our policies and our procedures. Foggy glasses, kind of an obvious one. If you haven't suffered foggy glasses at some point in the last year, you haven't been wearing your mask. So, foggy glasses we can manage the risk of COVID by requiring everyone to wear masks, which is appropriate. But now you might have someone driving a vehicle with foggy glasses, or I've seen injuries from participants walking in sketchy terrain while they're all fogged up and didn't see some of the hazards that were there. So we've created one risk by managing another. Last one I'll mention is less of a physical or medical risk and more of a mental health risk. And I've seen programs, camps, and outdoor programs that have defaulted to a single tent strategy, every participant in their own individual tent, to mitigate the impact of transmission of COVID from one participant to the next. And while that does effectively mitigate or address some of the concerns around COVID in different populations, now it might really ratchet up anxiety about sleeping in a tent by yourself at night with participants that aren't accustomed to camping to begin with, and really questioning, why are we doing this program again? Like what, if what we're doing is really creating so much anxiety in the participants, we've managed the risk of COVID, but we've created this new risk that wasn't there to begin with. So just wanted to give you some really specific, concrete examples of emergent risks, and hope, again, it comes back to this notion that, the hazards that we identify at the beginning of the trip, beginning of the program design phase, may not be the same ones that emerge as the program goes on. And it highlights the importance of really wanting to, dynamically assess that as we go. So what I would like to do is here give you a chance to talk a little bit about your examples, your application of some of these concepts. And why don't we, Paul, if you're able to launch some small groups, let people take 5 minutes, please quickly introduce yourselves and then jump right into sharing some of your examples of emergent risks, not necessarily COVID related, but emergent risks that come up for you from this concept and from this discussion so far. And when we come back together in the big group, we're going to invite you to report out from some of those smaller groups and share some of the examples. So that's what's coming next. Small groups, share your emergent risks with each other, and then be prepared to share a few good examples when we come back together in the larger group.
Okay, Steve, I'll open the rooms now.
Thank you so much.
Tiffany, I see you there on the screen. I don't see you on my breakout screen. Do you need to be put? Okay, here we go.
All right. It looks like everyone is filtering back into the big room here. And we have this is a short session. So we really just have a few minutes. And in that time, I would just love to hear from a handful of the groups, some of the key things that popped out for you. Emergent risks is really the topic here. So how about a couple examples of times where you recognize that we have managed one risk, but we've created this new one that wasn't there to begin with. But I'd love to hear some examples that I haven't thought of in the past.
We had a risk pop up with participants when we we stopped an outdoors program because of the pandemic,
Mhm.
and then people were reporting greater levels of depression and anxiety in the
Mhm.
clients. I wonder if
Exactly.
others said that.
Yeah, that's a really good, thank you. Nice to see you, Aaron. That's a really great example of how we manage one risk, right, by closing the program down. But we have really, on a massive scale, created a vacuum, created mental health issues and anxiety and all kinds of things that as a result of taking away that resource. So we manage one risk and we create another. That's a really big picture one. Thank you for that, Aaron. How about some other ones from folks?
One that came immediately to mind to me was in a more alpine terrain where weather windows and time is really important. Whether
Mhm.
you forego roping up on, technical terrain, third, fourth class, low fifth class, is, you take advantage of the time efficiency of not having a rope, but then you're adding in the risk of not having a rope, and that's a big trade-off there. But it's a really important one that we see a lot.
I really like how you framed it as a trade-off. I think that's exactly what it is. You're gaining some benefits from this approach and you're trading off some security and you're escalating the consequences if a mistake is made, but you're maybe moving more quickly. Maybe you're exposing yourself to that terrain for a shorter period of time, less chance for rock fall or night or lightning. So it's using that term trade-off is a brilliant way to describe, it's not a domino effect. It's more like that interactive Swiss cheese with the pieces bouncing all around. So I really appreciate your framing it that way. Let's hear a couple more.
I know if our trail at New River Trail State Park down in Virginia, it's a rails to trail park with multi-use, so you have horses, bikes, hikers all on the same
Mm.
trail. Well, this year with COVID and everything, you have a lot more people. If you looked at bike sales and stuff like this, for example, you have
Mhm.
so many more people on the trail, but not a lot of people know like the proper courtesies. Like you're supposed to stop for a horse. You're supposed to let people cross the bridges and stuff like that. So those kind of issues. Luckily, we didn't have it this year, but could have been a potential for a lot of conflict and risk.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to just that remarkable explosion of use on public lands and the good things that come from that, and some of the obvious challenges and risk issues that that's created. Thank you, Zachary. It's a good one. How about it? Does anyone have any kind of completely different ones? It's easy to talk about the physical, the medical ones, but were there some other maybe mental health related ones or unexpected ones that anyone would like to share? Or ones
I
that
got
were
one.
just, yeah, go ahead.
So we're gonna run an overnight backpacking trip this spring in April. In doing all that, it's all the things you're talking about. With students have to drive to the trailhead. We've got that going. Camping, single tent, we got that going. And then cooking will also need to be done, individually. And so what I'm thinking is, there's a tremendous amount of the a lot of stuff happens in the space where folks are just together. They're cooking, they're eating together, that kind of thing. You know, we run the risk of really losing out on all of that, kind of the hidden curriculum stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great example. Say a little more about just that hidden curriculum. I like that concept.
Well, it's not my term. I like most things, I've stolen it from somewhere. But uh, there's what we plan to do, and then there's the stuff that we know is going to happen. We want it to happen, and we do things to make sure that we facilitate those things happening, but we don't program them. Like I'm thinking, like the relationships that come from, you know, tenting and camping with somebody for a program.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very good examples. Anyone else have one you're burning to share before we move on here?
If I might
Kinda,
add, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, Todd kind of reminded me of a point he said. What term did you use, Todd? Opportunity curriculum or
The hidden curriculum?
hidden curriculum? So, um, say if you had a student and you were going to use like an opportunity teaching with like a mistake that they did, um, say like they didn't wear the right shoes and like they're starting to develop blisters,
Mhm.
and you kind of call them out in front of the group, depending like on how they feel about that, you can make them feel more excluded, and therefore there's kind of like another trade-off there with like
Yeah.
helping the good of the rest of the group, but you're kind of
Mhm.
singling it out this one person. And I don't know how that falls into like high risk management, but it just reminded me of that.
Well, I think what you're getting at there is a nice example of some of these competing things. Are we managing the risks of the whole group or of the individual? Are we managing physical risk of blisters, or, someone's sense that they're in the right place and in a welcoming, inclusive group, and all these different trade-offs again, competing factors. And I think the big, your examples, all of these examples that you entered were wonderful. And I think the relevance of this and why we're talking about it today is a few things. If we don't understand emergent risks, then we can have blind spots. We can think that we have ticked off all the boxes. We've identified the hazards, and now we're out just running the program. And we can have these real blind spots around these emergent things, right? And so what it requires us to do is be dynamic in our risk assessment, not just sticking to our checklist we came up with in the days or weeks before the program began, but continuously having situational awareness and communication and being on the same page with the participants and your co-instructors, and being dynamic in that risk assessment and focusing our attention on the emerging things that really matter. We have an acronym in the risk management world called STICKY, stuff that can kill you. Sticky. Pay attention to these emergent things that are sticky, and don't spend all of your time and energy on things that matter a whole lot less. There's a great story about airline pilots being fired because they were walking down the jetway with a coffee cup with no lid on it. And they were breaking a policy about the coffee cup with the lid, but what in the world did that have to do with getting their passengers to their next destination safely, right? So if we can focus our attention on sticky, the things that really matter, then I think we're doing a better service to our participants and to our organizations as risk managers. So our time for this session is short, and it's wrapping up here. I don't want to keep you from the next event, but I just want to say I've got my contact info here, my website. Really welcome follow-up comments and questions, about what we chatted about here today. I also dropped in the Whova app a blog post that I wrote, which is about some risk management concepts that you might want to check that out. And yeah, just really welcome any kind of follow-up comments, questions, or last comments that people would like to make as we kind of come to a close here.